Yeah. So I figured I'll talk for about, I planned 35 minutes, but it usually ends up 40 or 45 the way things go. And in fact, I'll start my stopwatch. And then I have some additional material that I can move back to if people are interested. So first of all, I want to put in a plug for a talk I gave last summer, which is slightly different. It's related. George, I think, put out talk is related to today, but slightly different, and it went very well. So, and it has a lot of credibility because of the venue. Plus, it was a different way of looking at the technological imperative for ethical evolution. The fact that we are evolving ethically, that we are much beyond where we were 50 or 100 or 200 years ago, and why we have to accelerate that, and telling stories on myself largely, because people don't like to be told you need to be more ethical. They much prefer hearing where I fooled myself, and where my wife then helped me to make sure I wasn't fooling myself a second time, things like that. So that's a plug for that talk. Today I'm going to talk on rethinking national security, and I sometimes joke that I should call it thinking national security, because we really haven't given a lot of thought to how we address national security in this country, or I suspect in almost any other country. But as an American, I focus on America's oversights, not because America is uniquely damaged, but because as an American, that's where I have power to try to change things, and I'm working on it. And also America as the preeminent military power in the world. It's really important that this nation become as rational as possible in its national security and foreign policy and military policy. Rethinking national security is based on a very simple observation. In 1945, at the end of World War II, the United States was absolutely secure. Europe was devastated, Asia was devastated, but the United States had not been touched by the war in our homeland, except very indirectly, and no one could attack us, not the Soviets, not the Germans, not the Japanese. Today, we've spent, in the intervening 75 years, we've spent trillions upon trillions upon trillions of dollars to improve our national security, but with the paradoxical result that today we can be destroyed in under an hour. It sounds like something went really, really wrong. And by the way, to put that into context, I'm thinking of a war with Russia, for example, which is not out of the realm of possibility. Not tomorrow, not next year, but over the next 100 years, for example, if we keep making the mistakes we're making, that unfortunately has a significant probability that I'll get into later in the talk. If this were mathematics, that would be called a reductio ad absurdum. Some of the technical people here will recognize that. It's Latin for reduction to the absurd. It's like an extreme proof by contradiction, which many of you some more of you may have heard of. When you use logical reasoning and end up with an incorrect result, that's a proof by contradiction. There has to be at least one assumption that's off. And a reductio ad absurdum is even worse. You not only ended up with an incorrect result, but an absurd result. And this is not mathematics, of course, and there may be other reasons. It may have been unavoidable that we'd end up here, but it would seem wise, it would seem prudent to re-examine the assumptions that form the basis for our thinking about national security. And my report does that. I'll do that. I'll repeat that today, and then we'll open up to discussion. And there are many questionable assumptions. The most fundamental questionable assumption is that it's possible to buy national security at the expense of other nations. That was true in World War I. It was true in World War II. If we had more battleships in World War I, if we had more aircraft carriers in World War II, if we had more bombers, then we could win the war. Today, if we get into a nuclear war with Russia or even China, or maybe even North Korea, the devastation to the United States would be so horrendous as to make it hard to say that we had won. And so the good news, let's see, well, so there's a statement in the report. It's page 7 of the report, and I actually encourage you to start there. It's been signed by about a dozen prominent people. The most prominent in terms of national security credentials is a former director of NSA, the National Security Agency, Admiral Bobby Inman, retired 4-star admiral. guy who, loosely speaking, wanted to throw me in jail 40 some odd years ago for publishing the work that won me the Turing Prize, the Turing Award. But we've since moved past our animosity, and we actually have become friends, and he wouldn't sign it if he didn't agree, but he also wouldn't have signed it if he didn't trust me. And so one of the lessons in the Nobel talk is friends are better than enemies, and that's the example I use. So the statement says, in the age of nuclear weapons, cyber attacks, terrorism, and environmental crises, is national security becoming inseparable from global security? If so, how do our current policies need to change? It's asked as a question. I'm convinced that the answer is yes, that national security is becoming inseparable from global security, including that of our adversaries. That's not in the statement, but it is in the report that all of the people who signed the statement asked to see and read. In addition to Admiral Inman, Jack Matlock, who was our ambassador to Moscow under President Reagan and then under first President Bush, has signed it. A man who was chairman of the National Intelligence Council, plus 4 Nobel laureates and Stanford's last president. So the nice thing about that is the average person should be able to understand that statement on his or her own, but it's nice to have people of that caliber having signed it to give them a comfort level. So you made the report available to people here, Chris?
Yes.
Oh, okay. And let's see. So I'm going to address the some of the questions that are raised, some of the assumptions that are examined in the report. Have nuclear weapons kept the peace? Well, let's first of all look at the evidence. To what extent is that an assumption that's present in U.S. foreign policy, U.S. military policy, U.S. national security policy? Mearsheimer, one of the deans of international relations, have called nuclear weapons weapons of peace. John Kerry, and I try to pick on Democrats when possible, not because they're worse than Republicans, but because people automatically assume that this is some people automatically assume this is against Republicans in favor of Democrats. And what I'm talking about here is something that neither political party has the correct approach to, and both political parties have accepted the assumptions unquestioningly. So John Kerry, when he was Secretary of State in 2013, in a speech to plowshares, of all places, said that a, quote, a strong nuclear deterrent remains the cornerstone of U.S. national security and that of our allies and partners. He doesn't address whether it's a cornerstone that's built on sand or on bedrock, and that's something we're going to look at today. To get an idea as to whether nuclear weapons can be relied on to keep the peace, the statistics person, the physicist, and the electrical engineer, and the other technical people will know what I mean when I talk about an order of magnitude estimate. For those of you who haven't heard of it, in engineering and science, when we're trying to estimate something only very approximately, like we can't say whether nuclear weapons can be expected to keep the peace for 50 years versus 100. We could really argue about that. We would round 50 to 100, and we would only deal with powers of 10. So I've asked around 1,000 people over the last 10 years, how many years, just to an order of magnitude, do you think we can go on our current path before nuclear deterrence fails and we have a failure of deterrence that results in a full-scale nuclear war, not just a few weapons being used, but complete failure of deterrence that destroys civilization? Almost everyone, by the way, I call that the nuclear time horizon. It's not that if it's 100 years, it'll happen at 100 years, but we expect about 1% a year if it were a 100-year time horizon. Almost everyone sees 1 year as too short. In fact, everyone, I have to say, has seen 1 year as too short an expected nuclear time horizon. That is, while a nuclear war could happen in the next year, it could happen as we sit here if there are things going on that we're unaware of in the world, it's unlikely to happen over the next year. We've gone 50, 60 years, depending on nuclear deterrence. It's unlikely to fail within the next year. Similarly, almost everyone, although there are exceptions, sees 10 years as too short, too pessimistic a nuclear time horizon. We can probably make it through 10 years. We may not, but we probably can. I jump over 100 and I go to 1,000 years. Now, of course, things will change over the next 1,000 years, but what I'm really trying to get at is the risk over the next year, the next 10 years, maybe the next 100. if nothing were to change over the next 1,000 years, and we kept having Cuban Missile Crises maybe every 100 years, something of that magnitude, Ukrainian wars every, oh, let's see, there's the Ukrainian War and the Georgian War were less than 10 years apart. So we have to expect wars like that about every 10 years based on recent history. The 1999 Pristina Airport crisis, how many of you know about that? Okay, it ended, I'll just tell you, this was when the Kosovo Civil War was being drawn to a close with help from Russia. Russia helped put pressure on Serbia, its traditional ally, to negotiate a ceasefire. And General Wesley Clark was the 4-star American general in charge of NATO troops called Supreme Allied Commander Europe, SAC-Europe. And he became concerned or paranoid, depending on your perspective, that the Russians might move an independent peacekeeping force into northern Kosovo. And it could be the end of NATO, and this comes from his memoirs that I've read. And we might have to shoot down Russian transport planes if they violated Hungarian airspace to bring in support. And so he gave orders to a British 3-star, General Sir Michael Jackson, who was under his command, to evict the Russians, because they actually did take up the peacekeeping position at Pristina, to evict them, and if need be, to use force, to threaten to use force, because he was convinced that would get them to move out. I've read both their memoirs, and they both agree that a heated argument ensued, which ended with the British general, the 3-star, telling the American 4-star, Wesley Clark, "Sir, I'm not starting World War III for you." Now, this doesn't mean, now Clark maintains that the Russians would probably have backed down, and I think he's right. The Russians probably would have backed down, but what does probably mean? 75%, 90%, 99%? How big a risk are we willing to tolerate that they didn't back down and that we'd end up with 200 dead Russians and 200 dead British troops? And where does it go from there? So when you start to think about all the things you don't know about, like the Pristina Airport crisis, the false alarms that have occurred, the nuclear proliferation that has occurred, not as badly as we feared, but North Korea now does have nuclear weapons. India, Pakistan, to take something that you study. 1,000 years seems wildly optimistic to almost everybody. That is, to think we could go through 20 repetitions of the last 50 years and not have a mistake occur that would lead to a crisis that would actually lead to nuclear use and therefore the end of civilization. Well, if 1,000 years is too long and 10 years is too short, the only order of magnitude estimate left is 100 years, which corresponds to 1% per year. Now, I'm not saying it's exactly 1% a year. It could be 2% a year. It might even be 3% a year, or 1/3% a year, but that's unlikely. It's probably somewhere between 0.5% a year and 2% a year. And so let's just settle on 1% a year. What does that mean over the next 10 years? 10% risk. Almost, a little bit less, but very close to 10%. A child born today in the developed world has an expected lifetime of 80 to 90 years. If there's a risk of 1% a year, and you project over the next 80 to 90 years, that child has worse than even odds of not experiencing a full-scale nuclear war over his or her lifetime. I'm convinced of this, but if people disagree, we can discuss and see where we disagree. And so this is the nice thing about drilling down, and instead of just saying nuclear weapons are too dangerous, no, they're not, which is where people usually argue, which is far out in the decision tree, to drill down and to get to the assumptions where they might differ. We might still not agree, but at least we can see why we disagree. Oh, good news. Well, actually, before the good news, I'll give you... Actually, there is good news here, too. The best way to reduce the risk of a nuclear war is to reduce the incidence of needless wars. Because every war has some risk of escalating. Like the Kosovo, the civil war in Serbia, Kosovo, that led to the Pristina Airport crisis. The Syrian civil war, we accidentally killed or purposely killed I think it was a couple hundred Russians, who fortunately were not regular army, but apparently mercenaries. Many things, the Malaysian airliner that was shot down over Ukraine could have become a major crisis. Oh, there's the Cuban bomber mini crisis of 2008, which again, I assume no one here has heard of. I can send you a write-up on that at some point. I have to change one piece of it. Basically, I identified 5 or 6 key mistakes that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis itself. It wasn't just we went from normalcy to being on the brink of nuclear war. There were steps, there was mistakes that were made, and I identify in my mind 5 or 6 key mistakes. And in the summer of 2008, in July 2008, a month before the Georgian War, we had repeated 5.5 of them, or 4.5 of them. We were half a step short of the full-blown crisis, but fortunately that last half step never occurred. So the good news is the best way to reduce the risk of a nuclear war is to reduce the incidence of needless wars. And that's a real positive, because who wants needless wars? It kills people without needing to. It squanders national treasure. It squanders national reputation. And the good news or the bad news, depending how you look at it, in my opinion, every war that the United States has been involved in the last 20, 30, 40 years has been needless. Even Afghanistan, which you might say was needful because of September 11th, if you go back to 1979 and we hadn't started trying to kick the Soviets out of Afghanistan, they'd be having the mess in Afghanistan. We would never have created Osama bin Laden as a potential terrorist for executing the September 11th attack. So there is some good news about this risk, and it relates to the technological imperative for ethical evolution that talked to the Nobel laureates. Nuclear weapons are forcing us, if we look at them the right way, and these other technologies are forcing us to become more rational, more reasonable, more peaceful. One other piece of, I'll do one other quick explanation. Actually, no, I'll do this first. One other piece of good news. For roughly 10 years, I've been trying to get Congress to authorize a study by the National Academy of Sciences, and actually the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. We don't have a single national academy in this country. A National Academy study of how risky is nuclear deterrence and how risky is nuclear terrorism, and then how we might reduce the risk if it's too great. The good news is the fiscal year 2020 National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA, that was just signed in December by Trump after it went through conference, has a section in it, section 1674, which I think, oh, I sent it to you. George has it. It calls for the study that I've been trying to get. How did this happen? My friend here, Les DeWitt, talks. We're talking about this is the best thing we can do now. We can't actually change policy, but we can talk to create conditions for changing policy. Les was at a dinner at the University of Santa Clara on a different topic. The guy sitting next to him asks what he does. He says, I'm working with the Stanford professor, Marty Hellman, on rethinking national security. He goes through 1945, trillions of dollars later, under an hour, what went wrong. The guy, whose name is Tom Cooper, says, you know, I've never thought of it that way. I want to help you. And he actually works in ways that can help us. But as we're talking with him, and I can now tell you this, it turns out, I disguised it a little bit in July when I spoke about it at the Nobel meeting. As we're talking with Tom, he says, you know, you ought to talk to my cousin, Jim Cooper. He's a congressman. So I look up Jim Cooper. It turns out he's chairman of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee. And so we get on the phone, the three of us, 7 o'clock one morning out here, 10 o'clock in DC, talking to Jim Cooper. And he's found this old petition that I had on a website for this National Academy study. And he basically has made it happen. He doesn't agree with everything I say, but he feels that, yes, we ought to know how risky nuclear deterrence is. And that is in the section 1674. Whether the study will be done in a good fashion that produces useful results, we'll have to see. Whether those results, if they are useful, are then used to wake the nation up, we'll have to see. But this is one of the most promising things that's come out. In fact, I'd say it's the most promising development in my work in the last 20 years. I don't have time to go into what was more promising for 1987, but if there's time in the discussion, I'd be happy to discuss that. When talking with Jim Cooper, we went over the order of magnitude argument. And Jim is a former Rhodes Scholar, so he followed the order of magnitude argument that I just went through: 1 year, 10 years, 100, 1,000. But he said it would be good to have a simpler, non-mathematical explanation for the average person and the average congressman, congresswoman for that matter. And so Tom asked, and his cousin says, so how would you explain it? And Jim says, well, Marty's got a good way of explaining it on that website, and I'm going to tell you what he likes. I call it the man in the TNT vest. I assume you haven't heard this yet. Imagine someone came in late to the seminar and sat down right here, and he's wearing a TNT vest. But he says, please just continue. I want to hear the talk, enjoy the talk, ask your questions. I'm not a suicide bomber. I don't have the buttons for setting off this vest. There's a button in Washington with President Trump. I'm a very cautious man, so just relax and enjoy the talk. There's another button in Moscow with President Putin, equally cautious, so nothing to worry about. We'd be worried about short circuits. We'd be worried about the mental, whether they might go crazy, a whole bunch of things. We'd be getting out of this room as fast as we could, even though that man was not a suicide bomber. And so why, and of course there are buttons in other cities, as you know, and as we all know. So why, just because we can't see the weapons controlled by those buttons, have we as a society sat here for 50 or 60 years complacently assuming that because the Earth's explosive vest has not yet gone off, it never will? As if confronted with the guy sitting there in that TNT vest, we need to be plotting an escape route. We can't physically leave the Earth, but we can start to plot a route from where we are to where we need to go. And this brings up something very important. Some people assume that I'm talking about nuclear abolition. But I've said for 40 years almost that I've been working on this issue. If I had a magic wand and could wave it, and all nuclear weapons in the world would disappear tomorrow, but nothing else changed, I would probably not wave that magic wand. Because if nothing else changed, first of all, hawks in the American military, and there are some, might see this temporary superiority that we suddenly had. Right now, the Russians are our military equal with nuclear weapons. This would be the opportunity to wipe them out while we finally can do it without them really doing us in badly. Conversely, people in those other nations would start to rebuild their nuclear weapons very quickly. So just getting rid of the weapons is not the solution. We really need to change the mentality. We need to rethink national security at a fundamental level. And by the way, people who defend the status quo, like Les and I know people who were very high in the nuclear command and control of this nation. And I've talked, one person in particular, I've met with him and I said, you serve a very useful purpose even though we disagree. You are anchoring the current position so that I can explore where we need to go without fear that we will jump there discontinuously and dangerously. Just as I've explained, if the only thing that happened is nuclear weapons disappeared tomorrow but nothing else changed, that could actually be a more dangerous world. It might not be, but it could be. And so he's anchoring it, the status quo, and giving me the freedom to explore. By the way, I first learned this in my marriage. My wife and I used to have arguments about whether to do A or B, and what we realized is whichever of us anchored A allowed the other to explore B. And so that's why we automatically went like this. And once we learned that, we learned to appreciate one another rather than fight about it. In the same way, I see the defenders of the nuclear status quo as serving a very important purpose and giving me the freedom to do what I do. Other questions treated in the report. Well, I'm going to skip that. I'll skip that one because it always takes more longer than I think. Is our nuclear arsenal safe, secure, and effective? Well, what's the evidence that that assumption exists? Well, I'm quoting from President Obama's 2009 Prague speech, right after he committed the United States to seek the peace and security of a world free of nuclear weapons. 2 or 3 sentences later, he said, As long as these weapons exist, the United States will maintain a safe, secure, and effective arsenal to deter any adversary. And Trump's 2018 nuclear posture review uses very similar language. But is it a fact that our nuclear weapons are safe, secure, and effective, or is that an assumption? I'm convinced it's an assumption that warrants careful attention. First of all, safe and secure have very specialized meanings. Have they studied that here at all in their program?
In some of the, we have a mandatory course on nuclear issues. Well, not surety, but it is covered in some of the things. Okay. It's with safety and security.
Well, it turns out within the nuclear weapons complex, a nuclear weapon being safe means that there's a very low probability of it accidentally detonating in a crash or an explosion of a missile. That's very different from saying our nuclear weapons are safe and we're safe with these nuclear weapons. Similarly, secure has a very specialized meaning, although it's interesting that 2 years before Obama gave that speech, the Air Force lost 6 nuclear weapons in a very bad compromise of nuclear security. And effective is not actually defined anywhere. In fact, the one that I like is from September 1980, the end of the Carter administration. There were Senate hearings on PD 59, which was a presidential directive moving from massive nuclear attack to a very more of a surgical nuclear attack, counterforce instead of countervalue. And Senator Glenn, the former astronaut, at the end of the hearing says to Secretary of Defense Harold Brown, "I get lost in what's credible and not credible. This whole thing gets so incredible when you consider wiping out whole nations, it's difficult to establish credibility." To which Secretary Brown responded, "That's why we sound a little crazy when we talk about it." So what do we mean for effective or credible deterrent? Is there such a thing? It needs to be examined. Another assumption that Sig Hecker, who some of you may know, he's a former director of Los Alamos, a colleague of mine at CSAC at Stanford. I remember Sig telling me that when he was director of Los Alamos, whenever the question of testing nuclear weapons came up, some senator that was against a ban and who wanted to continue testing would always ask him, Dr. Hecker, can you be as certain of the reliability of our nuclear weapons without testing as you could be as if you continued testing? And he said, I had to tell them, no, of course you're more confident in your arsenal with testing than without testing. But that got me to think. There's an assumption that a more reliable nuclear arsenal makes us more secure. And in some ways it does, but in some ways it might not. And so I'm a mathematician by training, and so I go to the extreme cases. The extreme case, I don't know, yeah, I'll do this here, maybe I shouldn't. No, I'll skip that. Because non-mathematicians don't like it. But there's an assumption that to deter an adversary, we must be able to hit it with hundreds of nuclear weapons with high probability. Yet during the Cuban Missile Crisis, John F. Kennedy, the president, was deterred from attacking the missiles in an airstrike out of fear that even 1 or 2 missiles would survive and would be launched against Miami or Washington. If he would be deterred by the chance that 1 or 2 weapons might get through, why do we need to be able to be 99% certain of landing hundreds, if not thousands, of nuclear weapons on our adversaries? Similarly, if North Korea has a 50% chance of being able to take out an American city, maybe not even with missiles, but just by smuggling it in, would we dare attack North Korea? And so what level of reliability is actually needed? And is there, in fact, an optimal level of reliability? I won't go into that here because I'm taking more time than I thought. I'll skip. Oh, that's a good one. Is nuclear terrorism a greater risk than nuclear war? Well, first of all, what's the evidence for the assumption that it is? March 2014, President Obama, quote, "Russia's actions are a problem, but they don't pose the #1 national security threat to the United States. I continue to be much more concerned when it comes to our security with the prospect of a nuclear weapon going off in Manhattan." So there you've got Obama saying nuclear terrorism is the bigger risk in his mind than nuclear war. Similarly, Colin Powell in the Nuclear Tipping Point says something very similar. And yet a very simple argument shows that they're probably wrong. A nuclear war with Russia would probably kill on the order of 1 billion people, if not more. That's 10 to the 9th. A nuclear terrorist incident is unlikely to kill even 100,000. That's like Hiroshima. It would require a weapon of that sophistication, which terrorists are unlikely to be able to realize. The ratio of the number of deaths, 10 to the 9th to 10 to the 5th, is what? 10 to the 4th, 10,000 to 1. 10,000 times more people killed in a nuclear war than in a nuclear terrorist incident. So if you just deal with risk very simply as the expected number of deaths, which I think understates the consequence of a nuclear war would have to be at least 10,000 times less likely each year than nuclear terrorism for it to be the smaller risk. And that just doesn't seem possible to me. So there's an example where we really haven't thought through our, we've made statements based on gut feels that turn out, that I believe can easily be shown to be wrong. By the way, I'm not suggesting that we neglect the risk of nuclear terrorism the way proponents of dealing with nuclear terrorism are proposing we don't need to worry about nuclear war. I think both threats are important. Losing 100,000 people is significant, even if the risk is only 1% a year for nuclear terrorism, and it's probably greater than that. Furthermore, there is coupling. If you have a nuclear terrorist event, it increases the risk of a nuclear war because you now have a crisis. And so we need to think of these not in isolation, but as a system issue. Another assumption, nuclear diplomacy with rogue nations, in quotes, is a waste of time. We were talking about that over lunch. So, for example, the New York Times, about a year or two ago, wrote, President Trump is not the first US president to try nuclear diplomacy with the North Koreans. All 3 of his predecessors tried, all 3 failed. Implying that, well, this isn't going to go anywhere. Well, they're actually right, all 3 failed, but let's examine them one by one. The president before Trump, Obama, failed largely because he never tried nuclear diplomacy with North Korea. There were no talks. We shunned North Korea during the Obama presidency. I describe it as junior high school with nuclear weapons. It was a mistake on Obama's part to do that. I liked Obama from many points of view, but he made a mistake there in my conviction. The president before him, Bush, failed, but he's the one who killed our major nuclear agreement with North Korea called the 1994 Agreed Framework. In 2002, President Bush killed it for domestic political reasons. Now those words, domestic political reasons, are not mine. They're Sig Hecker's in a 2010 paper. He could be wrong, but he warrants some examination before you discount that. The agreement was in place from 94 to 2002. What's the evidence that it worked? And Bush should not have killed it. When did North Korea do its first nuclear test? Anybody know?
2006.
2006. No, exactly. 4 years after Bush killed the agreement. So they were unable to get, under the agreement, their plutonium stockpile was under international control. They could not access it. They could not extract plutonium for tests. They also had 2 large nuclear reactors under construction in 1994. The smaller of them would have produced enough plutonium for 10 nuclear weapons a year. It was about, at most, 3 years away from completion, and they stopped construction of it. The bigger one was about 5 years away from completion, 4 times bigger. It would have made 40 bombs a year. They actually couldn't make that many bombs a year. There's other things other than plutonium that you need, but they would have a huge plutonium stockpile if it hadn't been for that agreement. When Bush killed the agreement in 2002, those reactors had corroded so badly from exposure to the elements that they could not be completed. Now, why did North Korea do these things? Well, they were expecting, among other things, better relations with the United States, sanction relief, both of which they never really got. And secondly, they were promised 2 large light water nuclear reactors that are more proliferation resistant. The New York Times called them peaceful reactors at one point, which again is a mistake. There's no such thing as a peaceful nuclear reactor, but some are better for making bombs than others. And the Magnox reactors, the graphite moderated reactors that North Korea gave up, were excellent for making bombs. And the ones they were going to get, the light water reactors, were not so good for making bombs. President Clinton also failed. Actually, he didn't fail in nuclear diplomacy with North Korea. He put in place the 1994 agreement. So the New York Times was wrong when they said all three failed. There's a little more there, but I won't go into it. Is the United States the world's sole remaining superpower? There's an assumption that we are. You see it all the time. It's hard not to almost buy into that assumption. But it is an assumption. What does it mean to be a superpower? Does it mean destructive power? If so, is Russia a superpower? Is China a superpower? Is Pakistan? Is India? Is Britain? Is France? Is North Korea even potentially a minor superpower in some sense? Are we the world's sole remaining conventional superpower? That I think is true. But what does it do to be the world's sole remaining conventional superpower in a world with nuclear weapons and other technologies that make it easy to become a rival? If we're wrong in believing that we are the world's sole remaining superpower, has that mistaken belief caused us to take actions that have hurt our national security? I believe they have. We act as if we're the world's only superpower, and we create fear on the part of other nations by doing that. I'll skip that one. Well, let me come back to the fundamental statement. In 1945, the United States was totally secure. Today, trillions of dollars later, we can be destroyed in under an hour, and there's significant risk of that, as I think I've communicated to you with the order of magnitude estimate, or the man in the TNT vest sitting there. And so, are our assumptions valid that on which we've been basing our national security, or do we need to re-examine some, correct some, and possibly move forward in a whole new direction? I'm convinced that that is true. And let me remind you, I'm not saying we should jump there discontinuously. If the United States suddenly became reasonable, the world might actually be more dangerous. Why? Nuclear deterrence depends on being unreasonable. In fact, there's a 1995 report that came out of STRATCOM, the successor to the Strategic Air Command, called Essentials of Post-Cold War Nuclear Deterrence. In it, it said in black and white, I mean, I knew this is what was thought, but it was amazing to see it in black and white. The United States should cultivate a national persona that is vindictive and irrational, if our vital interests are threatened, because that produces fear, which is the working force of deterrence. So if we suddenly became reasonable, hawks within the Russian or Chinese military might see this as an opportunity to take us out while we're reasonable. Because if you're reasonable, you'd never use your nuclear weapons first, because you might have actually made a mistake and be starting World War III for no reason. If you've been wrong and the other side's actually attacked you, what's the point in destroying the rest of the world? So in a totally reasonable world, or a totally reasonable, rational actor, nuclear weapons might lose all credibility, and we might be in a more dangerous situation. So let me emphasize again that the world I'm talking about moving to is not something we can jump to discontinuously, and we need to be thankful for the defenders of the status quo giving us the freedom to explore where we need to go. So let me stop for discussion at this point, and what do people think about the need to rethink national security?